Hello everyone. This video is about data encoding methods. GIS technology is basically bringing the Earth features into the digital format. There are a number of data collection methods involved. We have so much of data that is available, and all those data has to be encoded into a GIS format. So at the end of this presentation, we will try to understand what are all the data capture methods that are available and what are all the different data sources from which we can encode the data into the GIS format. For example, we looked at the different model or data models are raster data model, vector data model, how to encode this raster data model, how to encode this vector data, and how to encode the attribute data are the content of this presentation. And finally, we try to understand how the linkage between the spatial and the attribute data has taken place. Basically, data capture, when you try to define, it is the process of encoding or entering the data for inclusion into the digital database. GIS is basically creating a digital database for further analysis, and all the source data gives us a knowledge of the locations of the variables, which is one of the primary requirement of the GIS. Any point in the earth, if you take, it has its unique location, and we make use of that information to bring that into a GIS platform, and the quality information of that particular located object will be given as an attribute table. So if you look at the different data sources, most of the information we have about our world contains a local reference. Placing that information at some point on the globe, GIS can use information from many different sources in many different forms. The primary requirement of the source data involves the location. So there are different sources of data that are available. For example, we take the conventional analog maps, which gives you the topographical informations, contours, the terrain features, cadastral maps, thematic maps. All these are the conventional analog maps, which can be a data map or a data source for the GIS analysis. Similarly, we can take the reports and publications as a secondary information from which we can get the secondary data which can be fed into the GIS as an attribute data. So this is one of the source, or sometimes we go for a survey and you try to create a report of that survey and bring that in the form of a spatial information by recording its coordinates. Similarly, aerial remote sensing, which captures the earth information, that becomes a base map and it becomes a data source, and that can be brought into the GIS. And another very important uh, data source is the satellite remote sensing. We have different sensors that is revolving around the earth from which we can take the images, and that can be used as the data source. And we can also go for doing a field data survey using GPS or total station and convert that into the tabular form, or the current GPS technology has the advantage of converting directly into the digital format, which can become a data source into the GIS. And now we also have the existing digital map sources. For example, Google itself can be used as a data source, and that can be brought into the GIS environment. So there are so many data sources are available, and we have to very carefully select the data sources depending on the purpose for which we are trying to do the analysis. The methods of data encoding, there are different methods of data encoding. Before we go into that methods of data encoding, we try to understand what are all the different types of data available. The data sources can be in the form of an analog. Analog means the conventional topographical maps. This can be in the form of a hard copy format in a paper form. For example, the topo sheets, which is a paper format, you can scan that and bring that into a GIS environment, and you have a table of statistical informations, socioeconomic data, population statistics. All those informations can become an attribute data into the GIS. And hard copy map of a particular earth and you can also take it in a satellite data, so that can be brought into the GIS. And another type of data is the digital data. Directly you can feed that into the GIS because it is in a digital form. And what are all the ways by which you can get this digital form is you can put that in a floppy, USB drive, CD pen drives. All those things can be the storage devices through which you can bring this digital data, and you get a digital map directly from a satellite. You can get a remote sensing imageries, you can take a digital database from some other source and put that into the GIS. And GPS surveyed digital data can also be a data source which can be brought into the GIS for further analysis. The inclusion of data into a database involves several techniques, but it mainly depends on the type of data. So to decide what type of encoding methods to be used, first of all, we should try to answer these questions. Whether the data is analog or digital. If it is in an analog format, then you have to choose an appropriate method to enter that into a GIS format. If it is a digital data, then you have to use an appropriate method to encode that into a GIS format. And whether the data are spatial or attribute. If it is a spatial data, you need a base map from which you can enter into the GIS environment. If it is an attribute data, first of all, you need to have a spatial information, and then you need to create an attribute, then try to link that with the spatial information. Or if it is a spatial data, whether the source information, you have to store it as a vector data format or in a raster data format. So these are the questions need to be answered before you select what type of data encoding methods are required. So this table gives you the possible methods of data encoding for different types of data sources. Say if the data source is a tabular data, and if it is in an analog format, the possible encoding methods are you have to enter all the analog informations through keyboard entry and bring that into the digital database, or you can scan the text and bring it into a digital database, or you can geocode after entering into the digital database. And similarly, if you have a map in the form of an analog data, for example, you have a topo sheet. The topo sheet can be manually digitized, or you can go for on-screen digitization, or you can use R2B conversion. And both the things has to be done after scanning the map, analog map, and bring that into the computer, and then start digitizing in order to bring that into a digital format. Similarly, if you have a remotely sensed images from a sensor, and if it is in a hard copy format, the only way by which you can bring that in the digital format is you have to manually digitize or on-screen digitization after scanning the remotely sensed images. If all these above said data is in the form of a digital format, the tabular data, map data, remotely sensed data, if everything is in the digital format, then the way in which you can encode all these things digital format is simply a digital file transfer is required, and geocode the information so that it becomes a spatially linked information. If the map data is in a digital format, first of all, you need to look at whether it is a vector format or it is in a raster format. Accordingly, you have to choose the file transfer methods. The remotely sensed images, most of the images today we are getting in the digital format, and either you can directly transfer the file into the GIS format and reformat it according to the requirement, or you can go for on-screen digitization or automatic raster to vector conversion if the remotely sensed images information you want to convert that into a vector format. Similarly, the GPS data, now all the GPS data is available in a digital format, and you can directly transfer that file and bring that into a digital database. Okay, now let us look into encoding the raster data. So I have two types of source data. Both are raster. One is in the digital format, other one is in an analog format. If it is in a digital map, then it is very simple to import that data in GIS, and all the image processing techniques can be used to bring that data into the GIS. If it is an analog map, first of all, you need to scan and convert the paper information into a digital format, which is a combination of pixels. Now the resolution of the scanned image depends on the resolution of the optical scanner that you try to use for scanning the image. The image is going to have a high resolution based on the optical device, optical scanner, and the image that you produce is a high resolution image. Then there is a possibility of optical distortion, or there may be some unwanted noises or spots that becomes a unwanted information into your map. The accuracy of the uh, analysis can be disturbed here. And if the scanned image is going to give you a low resolution image, then you would have lost some of the data, or in some places there may be a overlapping. Yeah, while encoding the raster data or entering the raster data into the GIS format, there are some commonly performed process in GIS. The first one is called as rubber sheeting or conflation. Image will have distortions which will prevent us from aligning an image in our map. The image distortions can be related to the parallax error, the unevenness of the terrain, or lens distortions. So, what happens there is, if you look at this image, the control points are the blue cross marks or the control points, and you have thick lines which is the original boundary, and there are dotted lines which is the rubber sheeted boundaries. So you could see the thick lines which has to be in the cross mark location, but it is moved away from the cross mark location. Similarly here, the thick line has to be in the cross mark. Here also it should be in the cross mark. Now what we try to do is, we try to pull this black line and fix it into the control point. So thinking that this map is acting like a rubber sheet, and you try to fix those control points. So basically what is rubber sheeting is, it is a non-uniform adjustment of a data set based on the movement of the known control points to the new locations. So this is one of the very important process that we try to do while encoding the raster data. And another process that we try to do is the georeferencing or registration. So this is well known for many of the GIS users. Assigning the geographic coordinates to any of the data with any other coordinate system is what we call it as the georeferencing, so that the map that you are trying to bring it into the GIS will go and geographically orient itself so that it can be used for further spatial analysis. Similarly, projection is another important processing that we try to do it. To portray the 3D surface of the earth onto a flat surface, we have to project this information. Sometimes the data that we try to get it will be in one projection. You need to reproject it into your required projected information. And scaling and resizing is another processing that we try to do it in raster encoding system. The match the scale of the image to the scale of the vector map or the raster map that you are looking at. And despeckling is another process in which there will be unnecessary pixels or dirty pixels or wrinkled pixels that will be formed when you try to scan the image. These pixels are called as speckles or gray pixels. And despeckling is the process of removing the speckles. There are some standard algorithms to remove those speckles. Similarly, grayscaling is another encoding raster data processing, which will convert the color image into a grayscale image. Usually we'll have a RGB color values, and the grayscale value conversion is taking the average of RGB values, will be converting that colored image into a grayscale image. This is the processing that we try to do it. And another process that we try to do in raster encoding system is the adjusting the brightness and contrast. When we try to increase the brightness of the image, it lightens the image, but the details in the shadow areas can be seen. And when you decrease the brightness, it darkens the image, and the details in the light area and the dark area turns black. And when you increase the contrast, it will distinguish between the dark and the light areas. And when you decrease the contrast, it will enhance the mid-level gray objects. So this is the process that we try to look at the image in an enhanced way. Thresholding is another process which segregates the gray values into distinct values. Color separation, it separates the features based on color from a composite map. You can take red color, you can take blue color, whatever the color that you want, you can separate it and identify the features. For that we use a process called color separation. And subsetting is another important process that we try to do it, that is breaking out a portion of a large image into one or more smaller images. For example, you take a satellite data which is going to have a very big area, and all those area is not used for your analysis. So your study area may be very small. Out of that entire image, you have to subset only your study area. For example, it may be a watershed boundary or an administrative boundary. So to do that, you have to do a process called subsetting, which will bring out your portion of your analysis separately, which becomes a smaller image, and further analysis can be done with that. Edge matching is another very important process when we try to bring two different maps into one GIS environment. For example, if you look at this, there are map sheet A and map sheet B. Both are adjacent images, but while georeferencing or registering, the edges are not matched properly here. But when you do a process called edge matching, the two different maps will be combined into one map, and all those edges are matched properly, and this process is called as edge matching. This is very, very important when you use two different maps or many different parts of the map, and you want to bring that into one map, and you use a process called edge matching to bring this into the GIS environment. The next is encoding vector data. In most of the cases, vector data are captured from hard copy printout or from digital raster image. Maps can be digitized and included into a digital database in vector format by hand digitizing with a computer mouse on the screen, or a digitizing table to collect the coordinates of the features. Following are the methods by which we can encode the vector data. Number one is the manual digitizing, on-screen digitizing, an automated software to convert the raster to vector conversion, and electronic surveying system which can bring the field data directly into the vector format. Manual digitizing using a digitizer board is one of the way by which data is encoded as a vector data. This was used in a very early days of digital cartography. It is a process that involves placing a flat map onto a digitizing table, which is called as a tablet digitizer, which will have a mouse or a digitizer puck, and the table has a grid of wires that can sense the movement of the mouse. As the digitizer puck is moved on the topo sheet which is laid on the tablet, it will be traced, and the coordinates x y will be recorded, and that will be transferred into the computer. This is one of the very tedious process, as you need to move the digitizer puck on the entire topo sheet or the map that you want to bring it into a vector format. The limitation or one of the disadvantage in this method is its slowness and the lack of accuracy, and the human hand is capable of a resolution level of only 400 dpi, which is one of the disadvantage in the manual digitization process. The next is the on-screen digitization, which is also called as the heads-up digitization. In this method, the source data is scanned and then brought into the GIS environment, and then try to use the mouse to digitize on the screen and try to convert the raster image into the digital vector format, which is called as the raster to vector conversion. And this vectorization requires the topological structure. Instead of a digitizer table, we use a computer screen. This is called as, hence it is called as on-screen digitization. There are several advantages of using this vector data conversion is through on-screen digitization is you can zoom in and zoom out at your required level, so that the accuracy of the digitization process is very much higher in this case, and the conversion is very faster when you compare that with the table digitization. And most of the GIS packages provide on-screen digitization, and there is a provision to digitize in the GIS packages. And There are two modes by which this GIS packages records the vector data. One is called as a spaghetti mode, which is the length of the card or the string mode, and then arc or node mode. These are the ways by which we can enter the vector data into the GIS format through on-screen digitization. Automated R2V conversion is using a software which will convert the raster to vector format. In this method, you have to scan the image, which will be a raster image, and pick the entity that you want to convert it into a vector format. Select the entity and the conversion will take place. And supposing if you give a map and use R2V, it will convert all the possible features into a vector format. And the user has to find out which feature is required for his analysis or her analysis. So the disadvantage in this method is all these vectors will be converted and it will not have any topological information, or there is which is in a non-topological mode, and later user has to go and develop the topological information for this vector converted data. And there will be several errors in terms of missing links, noise. In the process of conversion, certain pixels will be converted as points or lines, which is actually a noise. So this is the limitation of this automated R2V conversion. And if you go for electronic surveying system, for example, this GPS or the total station survey, the coordinates from global navigation satellite system receivers are digital data that can be encoded directly into GIS format. Verifying and quality checking of the vector data that we have created. The raw digitized vector data always contains some errors and omissions that are not evident until logical connections are established. For vector data, it must be included with the topological information before it can be used for any analysis. Some errors might occur as a result of computational miscalculations and rounding error in the GIS package itself. Most of the database errors result from very improper inputs. Even in most of the meticulous map preparation procedures, the finest equipment that you use and the best trained technicians, mistakes are likely to occur. And in the GIS, the errors can be in the form of an entity error, it can be in the form of an attribute error, or it can be entity attribute agreement error. Entity error is basically missing entities, or it can be a positional error, mismatch in the positions, incorrectly placed entities, and disordered entities. This can be called as an entity error. Whereas attribute error is the wrong data that has been inputted into the attribute table, which will not match with the spatial information. And entity attribute error is improper linking between the attribute and its spatial entity. For example, you may have two different point data. One is the spatial information is having a rain gauge locations. Another one is the point data with the soil sample collection informations. Both are point data, and you have two attributes, one for rain gauge locations, another one for soil informations. If these two are interchanged and then linked, then that is called as improper linking between the attribute and the spatial entity, which is called as an entity attribute error. In the process of verifying and quality checking of the vector data, what the user has to do is the user has to inspect the graphics that you have created, and by answering the following questions, errors can be identified. Whether all entities or the features that should have been present are entered or not. If all entities are there, then it is the first check. And is there any extra entities that is available which is not required for analysis? Try to remove that, clean off that. And whether all the required entities are in right place, correct shape and size. This has to be inspected before you go for further analysis. And whether all entities are connected to each other properly. Is there any mismatch between the polygons? Is there any mismatch between the lines? That you need to check it. And are all polygons or with single label point? If a polygon has two label points, then while doing an analysis with that polygon, there may be a conflict and your answers may not be coming out. So this has to be checked before you go for your analysis, whether all entities are within outside boundary of the control points or the tick marks. That also need to be ensured. Now once you verify and check your vector data entry, once you identify the error, it usually requires editing to remove the errors and for further processing. We can correct inaccurately drawn data or inaccuracies resulting from surveying, digitizing process, or through scanning process. We can also apply a simplified methodology in order to align the map correctly or obtain answers to the questions such as is the data complete or is there any duplicates available, so that you can edit your data or clean your data before your analysis. Many of the GIS softwares have this provision to identify and remove the errors automatically. The following are the major actions that has to be done before you go for your GIS spatial analysis. This table gives you an idea about the possible errors, how it looks like before correction and after correction. The first one is called as a pseudo node. These are the lines that you have drawn through digitization, and the center node is an unwanted node which can be deleted, and the process of deleting this is called as a dissolving pseudo nodes. And once you do that dissolving pseudo nodes, the after correction the line looks like this without the node. And undershoot and overshoot are the problem that is called as the dangling nodes. Supposing you draw this for a river, and if there is a connectivity for the river is missing here, then you may not do any flow analysis here. So before going for your analysis, you have to correct this error, which is the undershoot error. Bring this node and snap it on the line. So that process is called as removing the dangling node. Similarly, this is an overshoot, and that has to be corrected. And there will be a cluster node. All these cluster nodes has to be properly linked so that it will become a single node. All these things can be done using a method called dangling nodes. And sliver polygon is another error that will be encountered through digitization or any other process. You can see these two are the adjacent polygons which is having a common boundary, but since it is not digitized properly, you have an error called sliver polygon. So this has to be corrected through the process called removing the sliver polygon. And while digitizing itself, you have to take care that there should not be any sliver polygon. Sometimes in the digitization process, you would have repeated twice on the same line, so it will create some duplicate objects. And when you try to calculate what is the length of this object, it will be giving doubled information. So that has to be rectified. So you delete the duplicating objects, and there may be breaking crossing objects. You can see these two objects are crossing each other. Try to break it and put that as a node. And coordinate thinning, this is, you have too many nodes here and you have to thin that node points. And there may be a label error. You may have a duplicate label for one polygon. That duplicating labels has to be removed. These are the ways by which you edit your vector data and clean the vector data. Now, once your spatial data is encoded, the next thing is to encode your attribute data. The attribute data can be a digital data, it can be from a printed reports, or it can be from a manual survey. Basically, you need to enter this information into the GIS database. You have to format that and edit in order to fit into the GIS format. And designing the database requires to understand what is the purpose of this database that you are creating, and the tables that are needed, what are all the fields that is required, what type of data that you're trying to enter, what is the field size, what is the relationship between all these tables. Once you try to understand all these informations, then you can decide what type of data that is need to be entered, whether it is a numeric or text. Then you can start entering your attribute data. Once all the spatial and attribute data are encoded into the GIS format, the next thing is you need to link the spatial and the attribute data. Sometimes this linking of spatial and attribute can be done at the digitization process itself, or later can also be linked using identifier called unique identifier, which is called as the ID. So the ID of the spatial data and the ID of the attribute data are matched, and then you have to create a link between the entity and the attribute, which is called as the entity attribute linkage. Now once you link the spatial and the attribute data, now the GIS database that you have created is ready for further analysis. Now you have a spatial information. If it is in a vector format, it will also have an attribute. If it is a raster, then it will also have an attribute. Then you can do your spatial analysis. So in summary, the process of GIS includes the identifying the data sources. It may be from different sources. Find out which source is appropriate for analysis and pick out whether it is a raster or vector format and choose accordingly the encoding methods, and edit and clean the data without any error, and then try to enter the attribute information and link the spatial and attribute information. Once all these things is being done properly and organizing all the data is available for your further analysis. So this is all about the data encoding methods. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you.